It's time for us to check back in with People and Their Quilts. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Opal Harness, Hatmaker, 60 years a quilter. When Opal Hatmaker was 5 years old, her coal mining father, Jerry Harness, died, leaving her mother with 13 children and a 14th child born 3 months later. Their home was in the remote mining section of Anderson County, Tennessee, in a community called Laurel Grove. There was no Social Security then, no death benefits, and no insurance. Mrs. Harness employed all her resourcefulness and ingenuity in an endeavor to sustain her large family. Quilting became the mainstay. Even though Opal was only 5 at the time, she remembers well how it was. Pap died February 10th, 1918. He worked in the mines down in Briceville, in the old Tennessee Holler, I believe. That's the last work that I remember that he did. Well, that was about 8 or 10 miles from where you lived in Laurel Grove. How did he get to work? He walked back and forth. He said he went to the mines many a morning with his breeches legs froze. Said he worked in water in the mines many times, and when he'd walk home of a night in the winter, his breeches would freeze stiff and he couldn't walk. Walking the 16 miles was almost a day's work. How many hours a day did he work in the coal mines down there? 10 hours or more? Oh yes, maybe longer. I remember him leaving long before daylight and getting in after dark. Mother said he worked in the water, and getting out in the cold, walking home, was what caused him to take that flu and die. That was in the big flu epidemic when so many people died. You've told me that your mother depended on quilting to a great extent to feed the family. I suppose you helped. She laughed heartily. I reckon I did. I started tacking quilts, they call it tying now, when I was 7 or 8 years old, and if us girls didn't do it right, she'd make us take it out and do it again. That's why I learned it. Your mother made quilts to sell? She made them to sell, and then a lot of people would bring us the material, and we would make the quilts for them. Then, of course, it took a lot of quilts to keep that many kids warm. There's so many of us that we had to use anything we could get in order to have enough cover. You didn't see nothing like a blanket or anything back in them days. The quilts you made for yourself, would they be patchwork quilts with various patterns? No, we just made them out of old heavy clothing. They'd be too tough to quilt. We just take a big darning needle and run through them and tie them. We called them tack quilts. They didn't have no pattern, nor no quilting. They was just made out of big pieces of old wore-out coats, pants, and so forth. And we'd use feed sacks and flour sacks. Did you use cotton for the filling? No, we just stuffed them with any old rags that couldn't be used for anything else. We raised a little cotton, but not enough for quilt lining. My mother made socks and gloves and things out of what little cotton we raised. She had a spinning wheel where she'd make her thread. Those kind of quilts I've always heard called comforters. We just called them tack quilts, she laughed. It didn't take long to make a tack quilt. We'd all get around and tack one out in about 2 or 3 hours. When did the family do most of the quilting? All the time when it was too cold or rainy to work outside in the fields or gardens. We never wasted no time, she chuckled. When it was too wet to work outside, she had us working inside. All the girls worked on quilts. What about the boys? They used to help tack 'em. Yeah, they'd help sew, but they was embarrassed if anybody come in and saw it. Much laughter. They thought that was woman's work. Yeah, we'd get up as soon as it was daylight, and if we had something special to do, we'd get up for daylight. I can remember we just had one old coal oil lamp, and we'd try to fix breakfast, and all of us stumbling around in the dark. And you only had one lamp for the entire household? We had 2 for a while, and one caught fire down in the bowl, and we throwed it out the window to keep it from catching the house afire. We'd all be around the fireplace with that one lamp quilting till way in the night. It's a wonder that any of us has got any eyes the way we tried to work. I suppose you'd work 12 or 15 hours a day. Oh yes, we had a center table that we'd set the light on, set it in the middle of the quilt, and all of us could get around it, and quilt. We had the old-fashioned swinging quilting frames that hung from the ceiling. My mother wouldn't quilt on anything else, and I didn't either till you got me over there to that World's Fair. Now, most of the family was boys, I believe you said. Yeah, there's only 3 of us girls. When did you start doing the patchwork quilts, making the patterns? If we got a hold of, or if somebody would give us scraps of cloth, why we'd make little squares or 9 diamonds or something like that. The first pattern that I really remember her doing, she called it the Whitewater Beauty, and then somehow she got a hold of the pattern of the double wedding ring, and I've had that pattern ever since I can remember. I've had it over 50 years. Did you ever come up with patterns of your own? Yeah, we made up a pattern. We called it the 9 diamond. It was 9 blocks sewed together, and we would arrange it to have the different colors around, and try to match the colors to make it look pretty. When did they really start making the quilts with all the different patterns? Do you think they did that 100 years ago in this part of the country? No, they didn't have all these patterns like that. They had the grandmother's flower garden and the Lone Star, double wedding ring, bow tie, and the 9 diamond. It was after I was married that we went into all these different patterns. Of course, they might have been out there, but I just hadn't been nowhere to find them. Laughter. Now, the question that I'm always curious about is when they started tearing up and making them in little pieces and strips, whether they did that because they were just getting scraps here and there or to make it look pretty. Yeah, we like to make it look pretty. People would give us scraps and Mother would make our clothing, and we would buy material, and we would save all of that we could. And we make it as pretty as we could, arranged with the colors we had. You didn't have all the pretty materials back then as we do now. All the old clothing that we had, we'd get down and tear it up, and save every little piece, and then we'd separate it into different piles, and then, like if we had enough to make a whole strip for the quilt, then we'd make strips. It didn't matter too much about the color back then. We was just going to use them on our beds, but if we wanted to make it for somebody else, we'd try and arrange the colors to match. How long would it take you to quilt a quilt? Me and my 2 sisters and my mother could quilt one in a day if we really worked at it, and it would take a little longer to piece it, maybe 2 days. How much did you get for a quilt back then? We'd quilt a whole quilt for $1 and then raised it up to $2. We'd get $1 for piecing one if they were furnishing the material. People would bring a big bag of quilt pieces, and Mother would piece all the quilt tops she could get out of it, She saved every little scrap. What did you use for the filler? We just used 2 or 3 plies of old tops we'd sewn together. Well, would people come there to buy them, or would you have to take them out to sell? They'd come. When people would come and bring work for us to do, why, if we had anything that they liked, they'd buy it. Did you say once that you and some of the girls and maybe the boys would take the quilts around, deliver them to the people? Yes, if they ordered something and we get it done, If they lived in walking distance, we'd take them to them. But mostly what selling we done was when the women would come to pick up their quilts that they left for us to quilt, then they'd see what we had, and if we had anything they wanted, then they'd buy it. Mostly you wouldn't have enough scraps yourself and you were quilting for other people that would bring their own scraps in. How come they wouldn't do their own quilting? Well, I guess they's better off than we was. I don't know. And then there's some women that wouldn't dare stick themselves up with quilting if they could get somebody else to do it. Where did they come from? Around Laurel Grove mostly? Yeah, and Briceville and Oliver Springs, and there were people from across the mountain over in the New River sections. Did you do the real close, intricate stitching? Yeah, we done real good stitching, but we didn't know all these new ways to quilt. I don't think we ever quilted one by the piece like I quilt now. It was in fans. Well, if it took 4 of you 3 days to piece and quilt a quilt, and if you only got $2 for it, my calculation is that each of you got about 17 cents per day, or just slightly over a penny an hour. She laughs. Yeah, I've worked a many a day in the cornfield for O.Z. Duncan for 25 cents a day. Worked for him once 7 days in a row for 25 cents a day. We just tried to make enough money to buy sugar and coffee, things that we didn't raise. We growed our own corn to make our own cornmeal, and we usually have enough to do. But there was lots of time that we didn't have flour. We didn't have money to buy flour with. Ate cornbread 3 meals a day? Well, there's a long time that we didn't have that. We'd have baked potatoes for bread. We didn't have any bread. A lot of time we had baked potatoes when we'd be out of cornmeal. We'd just have baked potatoes and bake them with the skins on. Did you have to stay out of school to work? Oh yeah, I wanted to go to school so bad. But in the winter it was cold and snowy and I didn't have no shoes. Sometimes I'd tie rags around my feet when I was just a little girl and wear a pair of my mother's old shoes. It'd almost kill me when I couldn't go to school. You didn't have any shoes of your own? No. Well, I finally got an old ragged second-hand pair of high-top shoes. I guess you remember the old Red Goose shoes. When they snow on the ground, my brothers would go along in front and make tracks for me to walk in. That's how bad I wanted to get an education. I'd cry to get to school. I wound up getting a little education, which some of them didn't. I went to the 4th grade. I got through the 4th grade, but I had to miss a lot because Mother had to have us a lot. Had to work on the farm there. I guess I got more schooling than any of the younger kids did because I'd throw a fit to go. Wasn't any welfare back then, huh? No, there wasn't nothing back then. Well, I guess a lot of families were almost starved out. Well, if we hadn't worked and made everything, we growed so much, clay peas, beans, and if we had some shuck beans, then we growed beans that we shelled and had dried beans. There wasn't no way of keeping things like they are now either. We'd have dried apples, smoked apples, pickled corn, pickled beans. You couldn't hardly can anything and keep it back then. Were smoked apples the same as sulfured apples? Yeah, we just call them smoked apples and big barrels of kraut. And whatever we could can, you know, like berries. A lot of times we'd sweeten berries and things with molasses. We'd make molasses every year, raise the cane. We had a rule in the summertime to put up 1 mess of something every day. If we had to go out and get a few apples and cook them and can them, well, whatever. We'd put up a mess of something every day. Mother would call it a mess of something. Apples or beans or kraut? Yeah, something every day. And of course we held our cabbage up back then. Make a big hole in the ground for cabbage, potatoes, and turnips. Mother would take the small cabbage plants up that had small heads, pull them up, roots and all. Then she'd throw them in this big hole we'd dig and put straw around it. Then we'd get it full, we'd put straw back over the top of it and cover it up with the dirt. Then put planks over it. Put the planks so that it wouldn't leak down in there, and we'd go out during the winter and just get pretty white cabbage heads. They's the best you ever eat. Your mother must have been a good manager. Yes, she was. She had to be. If she hadn't have had the know-how, we'd have never survived, 'cause she knowed what to tell us to do and what not to do. Back to the quilting. Did you ever do any applique type quilting? Oh, yes. When did you start doing that? That was after I was married. I never saw anything appliqued till I was around 25 or something like that. The way we applique today is to take a sewing machine and zigzag it on, but we did it by hand back then. And you never started doing that until after you were grown? No, I don't ever remember seeing any of it till I was grown, the applique work. Well, there's another process where they go in from the back between where they sew, between where they stitch, and push cotton in there. They call that tufting. Yeah, where you'd push cotton in there, we call it tuffing. How would you get it in there? Well, I didn't do any of it till I was grown. I put a little piece of cotton down on the quilt top and put that little piece of material down on the cotton and just tack it down with my fingers, and then I'd take an embroidery around it. Of course, that's pretty hard to do, but it's pretty when you get it done. Then after you quilt it, the flowers that you put the cotton in would stand up a way, you know, like you could pick them up off. I've done that. That's what we call tuffing. When did you start making quilts on your own? After you got married? Yeah. After I got married, I've quilted a quilt out in a day for myself. My husband was working for Tennessee Valley Authority, and he'd leave 'fore daylight and get in after dark. And I'd put a quilt out sometimes 'fore daylight, and that night I'd have that quilt done. I was so glad to have something to work with that I just went to making quilts right away. Everybody around here was so surprised at me. How many quilts have you made per year on the average, would you say? I really don't know. I've sold $2,010.08 worth this year. In 1 year? I never kept a count of them. My granddaughter got me a calendar to keep a count of everything I do this year. I said, wait till I get 69 years old and then start keeping a record. I guess you've made more in the last few years than you've ever made. Yes, after I began selling them. Of course, now I've sold quilts for years, but after I found out that I could sell a lot more, I've been making a lot more. Me and some other women went down there to Fratersville Baptist Church back in the 30s, I think it was, and we made enough money quilting to pay for concreting the whole floor of the basement, putting in a new ceiling, and getting benches made for the church. We'd start work of a morning and we'd work all day, and sometimes we'd go home and eat supper and then come back and quilt of a night. People would bring us the material and we'd do the quilting for $5 a quilt and give the money to the church. We did this for several months until we had enough money to pay for fixing up the church. Then, when we got ready to start spending it, some of the men wanted to tell us how to do it, thought we didn't have enough sense to decide how to spend it. I told them that the women had enough sense to sit there and freeze themselves half to death and make the money, and that they had enough sense to decide how to spend it. Do you remember the first quilt that you sold that you made yourself? Yes, it was an applique tulip. That was after you married? I sold 100 chances at 50 cents a chance and got $50 out of it, the first one I ever sold. That was pretty good back then, wasn't it? Yeah, it was real good. Of course, there was a lot of work to it. It was all appliqued by hand, the tulip. That was the first one I ever sold. Do you have any quilts that you and your mother and your sisters made? Yeah, I have one that my mother pieced, but I didn't quilt it till long after she died. I've got it on my bed now. They didn't have the pretty quilts in your area, you have said. No, they wasn't pretty quilts to go on top of the bed because they didn't have the patterns and things to do with back then. Do you always use a thimble? Well, now a lot of people quilt without it, but I never could. I started using a thimble. Lord, I guess I started when I started sewing. You really have to learn how to use them. Did all the old people use thimbles? Do you remember? Yeah, but they didn't use the type they use now. The first ones that I remember didn't have any end in them. You had to push it, the needle, through with the side of your finger. I push my needle on the end of mine is the way I use mine now. Did you ever wear a needle out? I certainly have. I used one needle 3 years that my mother-in-law gave me when my husband and I got married. It was a little sharp blunted needle that had a real good eye in it, and I quilted and used that needle for 3 years, kept up with it, and now I lose them. You can't buy good quilting needles like you used to could either. Well, what happened to that one? Did you wire the back off of it where you put the... No, more the point, till the point would bend. You know you couldn't stick it through. Did you ever sharpen the point? Yes, I have. How do you sharpen it? Well, I take a file or a wet rock and rub on it. We have had needles to rust, and we'd put them down on the floor and roll them with our feet on the floor to get the rust off of them. Your mother didn't have any trouble getting you all to work, did she? No, she never did have any. They wasn't any of us lazy. I was never lazy, that's one thing I can say. I stay at something I do something even if it's wrong sometimes, she laughs. Well, I think people that keep busy enjoy themselves a lot more than the ones that just sit around. If I hadn't had some talent, and I didn't have enough education to have a great talent, if I hadn't knew how to sew and make quilts and things like that, I couldn't have survived after my husband died, because I missed him so much and it stayed on my mind so much and when I had something to keep me busy, I didn't have so much time to think about it. Opal Hatmaker's World's Fair Quilt. During the 1982 World's Fair in Knoxville, I had occasion to recommend and even sponsor some traditional mountain folk to appear at the Stokely Folklife Festival there. Opal Hatmaker was one of those I recommended. She spent an entire week there quilting while people from around the world observed and talked with her. After the last day of the fair was over and I was driving her home, I asked if she had enjoyed it. Her response was spontaneous, believable, and moving. That was the most enjoyable week that I ever spent in my life. I never enjoyed a week so much, nor met so many nice people. Opal wanted to do something to show her appreciation. It was for this reason she made this quilt, the World's Fair quilt, for my wife and me. It is interesting and significant, I think, but not surprising, that Opal, who has quilted since she was 8 years old, would select a quilt as the ultimate manner in expressing appreciation. Lucy Stooksbury, laziness has killed more people than hard work. One of the most common family names in the northeast part of Anderson County, Tennessee, and in the adjoining counties of Campbell and Union, is Stooksbury. They trace their ancestry back to one Lord Stooksbury, an Englishman whose son William came to America in early colonial times. William's grandson Robin came into this frontier area from Virginia shortly after 1800 and is presumably the progenitor of all the Stooksburys in this immediate area. Tradition has it that these Stooksburys intermarried with the Cherokee Indians. A few miles north of the village of Andersonville, in an area known as the Ridges, lives Lucy Stooksbury in the ancestral home place. Lucy has outlived all the old folks and now lives alone on the remote homestead. Although she is now frail and in ill health, she remains feisty, witty, and an incessant talker. I told her of my interest in quilts and thus sparked an immediate and enthusiastic harangue. The first quilt I ever quilted was around the world. Lena Robbins lived down the road here, and she come and stayed with us 20-something years. I give her the pieces, and she pieced this round the world quilt. She just wanted something to do, and when she got it pieced, I quilted it. And they's a woman come in here a few years ago wanted to buy it, and I sold it to her, and then I hauled off and pieced me another one and quilted it. Uncle Joe stayed here with me and Daddy for 45 years, and Daddy died and left him here with me. And I took care of him after that for 19 years till he died. He had 2 strokes, and I'd have to stay close by, and I'd quilt. I used to piece quilts till 12 o'clock. I do my sleeping of a morning. I still yet sleep of a morning. Lord, I couldn't tell you how many quilts I've made. I give Johnny's children all one. I made an old wild rose and took it to the fair in Clinton and won 2nd place. That's the prettiest thing you ever saw. We used to have an old iron kettle out here we washed in, you know. That's the way we done all our washing. And then I got rich in '39 and got this here electricity in here. Bought me a washing machine, a Speed Queen, and used it 35 years, and the bottom came out. And I went down here at Daughtry's and got me another Speed Queen, paid $99 for the old one, and the new one cost $139. Shows you what a change they is. And these shoes I've got on cost $26. You used to get a pair like this for $2 or $3. There's not many women around here makes quilts anymore. Run up and down the road in these here automobiles and don't have no time for nothing. Laziness has killed more people than hard work, but they've gone back to it, making quilts, down here in Oak Ridge. They say they're making quilts like everything. Lucy Stooksbury's wall-hanging quilt square. My aunt over here in Knox County, her name was Dunnis Hill McAfee. I'd go over here and stay a week or two at a time with her. She didn't have no children. One day, it was 1927, she wanted me and her to make something, and we made that there quilt square, and I've had it framed, and I've kept it ever since. Lucy Stooksbury's wool-lined quilt. I used to help Daddy raise sheep. One time they was one of our sheep that got tangled up in the wire fence up here next to the Louis Nelson place, and it couldn't get out and it died. I found it up there dead, and I pulled the wool from it by the handful. I took that wool and washed it, cleaned it, and carded it, and used it for batting for this quilt, the Irish chain, and I've used that quilt all these years. That was back in the 20s when I made it. Bernice Hensley of Indian Fork, Unicoi County, Tennessee. If you're heading for Asheville, North Carolina from Irwin, Tennessee, going up Indian Fork, you may notice a crudely lettered sign which reads Calico Quilts. If this doesn't get your attention, the arrow above it pointing upward at a 45-degree angle should. There's a reason for the arrow's odd angle. It is designed to draw attention to the white farmhouse on a sizable hill a few hundred yards off the road at the foot of a laurel-covered mountain. It was almost dark when we arrived, and I wasn't sure anyone was home, but when I got to the front porch, I smelled country ham frying. It wasn't long before Bernice Hensley came to the door, a handmade towel in her hand and a smile on her face. I told her what we were doing. She turned her supper off and invited us to a small upstairs room where her suspended quilting frames filled the entire space. She started quilting for us and never slowed as I queried her. I asked her about the quilt she was working on, how long she had been a quilter, and what she charged for quilting. "Oh, I've worked on this one ever since last summer, and I've still got a couple of months to go. I'll get, if I'm lucky, 25 cents an hour, and them's hard hours. Time I buy the material, and law, it's expensive. I'll do well to get that much. This here one is supposed to go to a woman in New Jersey. Says she's going to take it. I've got her name and address, and I'm supposed to let her know when it's finished. I've got me a TV set in here, and when you see some long ugly stitching in the quilt, why then you know they's something that come on that I wanted to watch." Laughter. "I wear this here shade to protect my eyes. After a few hours, my eyes get sort of tired." I asked her if she liked to quilt, and this brought a quick, positive reply and a smile to her face. "Oh boy, I love to quilt. I garden and work in the yard a lot when it's warm and in the summer, but in the winter I quilt. I enjoy quilting more than anything I ever done. I learned to quilt from my mother, and she's still quilting, past 90 and still quilting. I was raised up here on the Holston River at Emmett near Bristol. I was a Hensley 'fore I married, and I married a Hensley. Yeah, I like to quilt. Get up here in this attic room and just set and quilt all by myself. Nobody to bother me. I'd rather quilt than anything I ever done. I've worked on this one since last summer, and I've still got 2 months to go. I'll get it if I'm lucky. 25 cents an hour. Bernice Hensley had this double wedding ring quilt up the day we visited her. Bernice admires the log cabin quilt she had recently finished. Hanging in the window behind her are a number of the ribbons she has won on her quilts in various shows. We'll stop right there for today. My goodness, it's got windy while I've been sitting out here. Everything was still and calm when I started, and now the wind's just howling. I really enjoyed this part. I love hearing from all these ladies that John Rice is finding and talking about their quilts. The first lady today that he spoke to, Opal Harness, my goodness, could you imagine the way her daddy worked? Walking those 16 miles a day back, that was to and from, 8 miles each way. And then having to work in the water in the mines, that's interesting. And then when you're walking, of course, in the winter, your breeches legs, as she said, that's what we would say, would freeze. I just can't imagine. And then she said that was during the flu epidemic, and he got the flu. Well, you can imagine all that walking in the cold weather and the cold water sure didn't help him, and freezing. I can't even imagine today, when I'm lucky I've not been sick in a long time, but when you get the flu and you have a high fever or any kind of virus or anything like that, what a wonder it is to have medication that would excuse me, that would help you get better. Of course, you can go to the doctor if you need to. I sound like I'm getting sick, but I promise I'm not. I've just been talking too much this morning, too much reading. Anyway, really just heartbreaking to think about that. And then that she didn't have shoes, and she wanted to go to school so bad. You know, she really wanted to go to school, and would even tie up her feet, and her brother's walking in the snow to make a path for her. Just so heartbreaking that they lived such a tough existence. An existence that most of us can't even imagine. I can't imagine having to live like that. Yeah, just such. But then she seems like a really happy person, you know, and really excited about her quilting, excited about getting to go to the World's Fair. I got to go to that World's Fair. Of course, I was at the age that I wasn't thinking about quilting, of course, but not even heritage. So I was just excited about the giant Ferris wheel and those type things. So I didn't visit that area that they're talking about and see all those crafts. Boy, I wish I had, though. And then interesting that the mother, another really resourceful woman there, reminds me again of Dory and Dory, Woman of the Mountain, of her mother, but that she got them all to quilt, and she knew that was kind of the mainstay of how they could make it. Of course, they still had to work in the fields. They had to do all the taking care of the farm. I'm sure they had animals, but that she got them to quilt. And it sounds like Opal, which is many times the case, that she went on to maybe have a more financially, at least economically, a better life with her husband working for the TVA. And really touching that she said there towards the end of that part, that after, you know, she was thankful for quilting. Again, all these ladies said they'd rather quilt than anything. They loved it. They were just crazy, plumb foolish about quilting. But really heartwarming and tender that she said she don't know what she would have done without quilting after her husband died, because she missed him so bad, and it gave her something to do and something to keep her busy. I've heard Granny say the exact same thing about Pap, that after he died, she was so thankful that she already crocheted before Pap, you know, and I'm sure that, of course, well, we know that Opal did, because she'd been quilting since she was 8. But anyway, Granny said the same thing, that once Pap died, that crochet give her something, you know, during the day to think about and put her mind on, instead of just sitting there dwelling on how much she missed Pap. So that was really touching when Opal said that. And then, you know, and again, all these people were such hard workers, but Lucy Stooksbury, sounds like she took care of, she said the neighbor come there and stayed for 20-something years, so I'm wondering if she took care of her. But then she definitely took care of her daddy and her uncle. Her daddy passed away, and she just continued to take care of her uncle, and had to stay right with him after he'd had his strokes, and that's when she quilted. So again, just such hard workers. And the last one that he spoke to, Bernice Hensley, you can just imagine John Rice really painted a pretty picture there of with his words of describing that sign that kind of, you can imagine it was, you know, in the house was in the foreground there, and in back of, as we would say, of that sign, probably a good piece. But the arrow kind of pointed up, so if you looked up, you might see that white house on top of the hill and realize that's the place that had the quilts, if you were interested in buying one. But then when he gets up there and doesn't think anybody's home, but he can smell country ham frying, you can just imagine how cozy her house was, and her answering the door and then taking them right up to the room where she quilted. And then we can see from the pictures it was a real cozy place too. So makes me wish I could have went and actually visited with Bernice there at her cozy house. I've been very blessed to be born into a beautiful family, and then have a beautiful family of my own, a really good family. So I'm a big proponent of that. I know everybody doesn't have that, but oh my goodness, I wish everybody could have it. And that's one thing that's really jumped out at me. All these people that he's talked to, John Rice, that family they all spoke of family, most of the time helping their mother. Mostly it was mothers that taught them how to quilt or let them stitch or whatever, But it was all like I guess a team effort, thinking of Opal's family there, all of them, 13 children, and the mother and the daddy dies, and they all pitched in together and helped. And I'm sure they did in many other ways as well, but, she's specifically talking about the quilting. But family really has rung true in these parts that we read today, but also in the other ones. Even Bernice said her mother was 90 years old and she was still quilting. That's just such a beautiful, beautiful thing. I hope you enjoyed this part of the book. I hope you'll leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you. And as always, I hope you drop back by next Friday and we'll see who John Rice talks to next.